Welcome to Voodoo Whiskey Gaming, and this is my late review of Cold Fear. I played it on PC through Steam because it's an old game. You can play it on Xbox and PS2 if you have them. Okay, so let's get into the story. You play as Hansen, who is a member of the Coast Guard who is called to a Russian whaling vessel, and you quickly learn that there's nobody really friendly on this vessel, as the rest of your team is killed almost immediately, and the Russians on the ship start shooting at you. But before you know it, there's like zombies and these weird like tentacle creatures, and as you go through the game you run into more creatures and you find out that there's some crazy shit going on. I would throw out there like I normally do and then shit goes sideways, but I mean pretty much when you start this game, the shit has already gone sideways, you are dealing with the sideways shit. And I'll say the story's pretty good. I'm not necessarily in love with it, and there are definitely moments, things that happen that just don't need to happen multiple times, but they do. The story that's there isn't terrible, there are just some elements that aren't well done, and it shows. But let's get into the audio, and I gotta say, I enjoy the soundtrack overall. I think it's pretty decent. I mean, again, it's not going to be the most memorable one, but it's not terrible at the same time. As for the sound effects, I think the sound effects for the most part are good. The guns sound like really shitty toys, but the creatures and the ocean and the ship and all of that, that sounds good. I think the sound design there is well done. The voiceover work is actually better than I was anticipating, not to say that it's amazing by any stretch, but it is much better than I was expecting. Now let's get into the gameplay mechanics and whatnot, which this is a third-person survival horror game, and I'm gonna say right away, it's light on both the survival and the horror elements. While the enemies can kill you very quickly, there were times where, man, they just went right through me, which lends to the survival bit, but the problem is health, while somewhat scarce, not super scarce, and ammo is so plentiful, it's kind of laughable? For like a true survival horror title, there is just way too much ammo just floating around. Everybody you kill drops ammo, they always drop ammo for your gun that is lowest on ammo. I mean, I was walking around with one gun that was ever low on ammo, and it was just the gun that I happened to be using at the time. As for health, there were a few times where I got low and I got a little concerned, but it wasn't one of those things where I was legitimately worried because I knew if I wandered around or if I backtracked, I was gonna find health. Another thing that needs to be addressed is the save/checkpoint system in this game. It's shit. There are times where you bounce from checkpoint to checkpoint like within minutes of each other, and then there are other times where you can be wandering around 30-40 minutes without hitting a checkpoint, so if you die in that time, you're gonna lose that amount of gameplay. Through most of the game, I didn't find it to be a problem, but you get to certain areas where there's a lot more area to explore, and it gets really problematic. Because there's no safe room you can go save in, it becomes a bit of an issue. That being said, it's not like a huge open world, but there is a lot of exploration like you would expect from any survival horror game of that era. I will say that I do like the level design. I think it's well done. I think it's pretty well mapped out. I like that they give you a good amount of weapons. I think they maybe could have toned back how rapidly they give you weapons and, you know, how much ammo they give you. As for like the scary bits, you know, it's not super scary. It's a few jump scares, but the game is so well lit overall that I found that it didn't do a good job of making me scared of what was in the dark because you could always see it. And there was nothing that was ever really too scary because they just kind of gave it away well in advance, or they didn't build up enough to it, so that just didn't really work. Some of that being said, I will say that there are some really cool details in this game. I'm going to jump into some of those later because they're not super important, but there are some that really affect the gameplay, and they seem small at first, but when you think about this being a PS2 era game, it's kind of impressive. Like when you're on the ship, waves will crash aboard and they will knock you around and do damage. The ship will be rocking and you could actually almost fall off. I never fell off, but I feel like it was definitely a possibility. It was a threat at times. When I got the flamethrower, there were times where I was using it out in the open and the wind and rain was blowing it away and destroying my range with it. It was actually pretty impressive because those things actually affect the gameplay. It's kind of hard to light a guy on fire who's 15 feet away when your flame's being blown away. But overall, I just feel like the whole survival horror element of it kind of falls apart with so much health, so much ammo, like such a good targeting system too. It is a third-person shooter, and I guess this will start to bleed into the controls, but the aiming works very well on PC. So officially we're starting the control section, and like I said, the aiming works very well. Honestly, most of the movement is shit though. And that's because this game can't decide what it wants its camera to be. There are times where it is fixed in position and the controls work one way, and then there are other times where the camera switches to third person over the shoulder, at which point the controls function a completely different way. When it's third person over the shoulder, it functions exactly like you would expect a third person over the shoulder control to work, and when it's a fixed camera, it functions exactly like you would expect. Hit left, your character will go to the left of the screen. Hit right, they'll go to the right of the screen, etc. But it switching between that all the time gets messy. Now you can aim, and when you aim it will basically almost always be third person, but then there's also the ability to hit shift, which makes you aim at all times, and now it doesn't work the same way. It's weird and janky, and it could function so much better if they had just decided on a camera angle and a control scheme. Also, I will say from what I read, gamepad on the PC works for shit with this game. There are also some other small weird things, like instead of R reloading, it's F, which is just odd to me, and maybe that's just because most of the PC games I've been playing are more modern than this one. Another thing I don't really love is there's no tutorial for the controls, so you just kind of learn some of them along the way, which can be a pain in the ass. That being said, I will say they're responsive, and as I said, the aiming works very well. Now let's get into the visuals. Obviously, this is an older game, PS2, Xbox era, so it's not the prettiest thing you will ever see, but it's actually not as bad as you might expect either. There are a lot of cool visual details in this game that really impressed me. Like when you're walking into the wind and rain, your character will put up their arm to guard their face from it. As I mentioned earlier, the wind and rain will affect your flamethrower's distance, which does also then affect gameplay. Small things like walking through puddles of blood will leave footprints. When you look into a mirror, you will actually have a reflection. Like, small things like that may seem silly by modern standards because, you know, modern games, but this was a PS2 era game, and it had all these small details, and that's just really impressive overall. That being said, I mean, it does look very much like a PS2 game. It's not the most beautiful thing you're ever going to see. The cutscenes are not pretty. The motion in them is not pretty. But I do think, like, the creature design is pretty cool, and a lot of the things they did to make the world, you know, seem like a real place, they did a good job with. So to wrap this up, I'm going to put it very simply. While there are some cool things like all those little details, and overall it's not a terrible game, it's also not a memorable game. Apart from having done this review, I probably won't remember that I played this game. So I'm gonna say skip it. Okay, so in the comments down below, why don't you tell me, what is your favorite forgotten horror game? That's honestly the reason I played this. I saw a list of forgotten horror games. As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. And if you like what I'm doing in general, share, subscribe. Have a good one. And that's because this game can't decide what it wants.